Bob Ross, the gentlest man on television, the man with the soft voice and the happy little trees, is about to walk onto the Tonight Show stage carrying a small wooden box. And what Bob Ross is about to confess to Johnny Carson, a secret he has carried alone for 12 years, will make the studio audience stop breathing, will make Johnny Carson press his hand against his mouth to keep from crying on camera, and will reveal that the entire premise of The Joy of Painting, the show watched by millions of Americans every week, was never actually about painting at all. It was about a promise Bob Ross made to a dying boy in a hospital room in 1979. A promise nobody knew about. A promise that explains everything. You will not believe what happens next. But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. September 24, 1991. NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was 14 minutes from taping. And in the green room, Bob Ross sat very still, holding a small wooden box in his lap. He was 49 years old. His famous permed hair was its usual cloud of soft curls. His denim shirt was buttoned to the second button. He looked exactly like he looked on television every week. Calm. Gentle. The picture of a man with no troubles at all. But the box in his lap was not calm. The box in his lap had been sitting on a shelf in his studio for 12 years. The box in his lap contained a letter that Bob Ross had written to himself in March of 1979 and had promised, on his honor, never to open until he found the courage to tell the truth. He had not opened it. Not in 12 years. He had carried it across the country. He had moved it from studio to studio. He had touched it before every single episode of The Joy of Painting he had ever recorded. 403 episodes. 403 times his fingertips had brushed the wooden lid. 403 times he had whispered the same 6 words to himself before walking onto camera. The audience never knew. His producers never knew. His own wife had never been told what was inside. But tonight, Bob Ross had decided. Tonight, on the most watched television program in America, sitting across from Johnny Carson, he was going to open the box. And what he was going to say next would change the way millions of people understood the soft-spoken man with the easel forever. The stage manager knocked on the green room door. "Mr. Ross, 6 minutes." Bob Ross looked down at the box. His hand was trembling slightly. He whispered the 6 words one more time. Then he stood up. And what happened next, nobody in that studio was prepared for. The Tonight Show that night had been promoted as a light evening. A movie star promoting a comedy. A musician with a new album. And Bob Ross, the painter, doing something fun with a canvas and demonstrating his wet-on-wet technique to a national audience. The producers had blocked out a 7-minute segment. They had set up an easel near Johnny's desk. They had laid out brushes and tubes of paint. Everything was prepared for a light, charming interview about happy little clouds. But Johnny Carson had read something in the pre-interview notes that had stayed with him all afternoon. Bob Ross had requested, very politely, that he be allowed to bring a personal item onto the set. He had not specified what it was. He had only asked that the producers not ask him about it directly. He had said, in his soft Florida-tinged voice, "I would like Mr. Carson to ask me about it when he sees it." Not before. The producers had honored the request. They thought it was probably a paintbrush or a small canvas. They had no idea. Johnny Carson stepped onto the stage at 5:30 p.m. exactly. The audience erupted. The monologue was sharp. Political jokes about the recession. A bit about cellular phones getting smaller every year. Johnny was loose, relaxed, in his element. The first guest came and went. A 9-minute segment that landed every laugh it was supposed to land. The second guest played a song. Everything was on schedule. And then Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, you know him from PBS, you know him from the painting that has hung in millions of American living rooms. Please welcome the host of The Joy of Painting, Bob Ross. The audience cheered warmly. Not the explosive cheer of a movie star. Something gentler. Something almost protective. As if the audience instinctively understood that the man walking out from behind the curtain was someone who needed to be received with care. Bob Ross walked out slowly. He was carrying the small wooden box in both hands, holding it the way a person carries something fragile that does not belong to them. He walked to Johnny's desk. He set the box down very carefully on the corner closest to him. He sat down. He smiled. "Hello, Johnny," Bob said quietly. His voice was the same voice America knew from television. Soft. Reassuring. But there was something underneath it tonight. Something the cameras could not quite name but could feel. Johnny looked at the box. Then he looked at Bob. Then he looked back at the box. He smiled, but it was a careful smile. "Bob," he said, "you have brought a box with you." The audience laughed gently. Bob nodded. "Yes, Johnny. I have. Are you going to tell me what is in it?" Bob looked down at the box for a long moment. When he looked back up at Johnny, his eyes were already wet. "I am, Johnny," Bob said. "I am going to tell you what is in this box. But I am going to tell the whole story first. Because if I just tell you what is in it without the story, then nobody will understand why it matters." Johnny leaned forward. The studio went quiet. Even Ed McMahon, who had been preparing a light interjection, sat back in his chair. "Take your time, Bob," Johnny said. "We have all the time you need." And that is when Bob Ross began the story he had not told for 12 years. In November of 1978, Bob said, his voice steady but soft, "I was 36 years old. I was a master sergeant in the United States Air Force, stationed at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. I had been in the military for 20 years. I had spent 2 decades being a man who yelled at people. That was my job. I was the disciplinarian. I was the one who scrubbed latrines and made grown men cry and shouted in faces. I was very good at it. And I hated every minute of it." The audience was completely silent. Nobody had ever heard Bob Ross describe himself this way before. Nobody knew the soft-voiced painter had spent 20 years in the military. Nobody knew the man who whispered to a camera had been a sergeant who screamed at recruits. "I had decided," Bob continued, "that when I retired from the Air Force, I would never raise my voice again. Not at anyone. Not for anything. That was my promise to myself. I was going to spend the rest of my life being the opposite of what I had been. I was going to be soft. Because the world has enough hard things in it." He paused. "And I had started painting. Just for myself. I had taken a class in Anchorage from a man named Bill Alexander. I was teaching small painting classes on the side. I thought maybe, when I retired, I could become a painter. That was the dream." Johnny nodded slowly. He was not interrupting. He was letting Bob find the rhythm of his own story. But wait. What you have heard so far is nothing compared to what happened next. Because in March of 1979, Bob Ross was about to walk into a hospital room in Fairbanks, Alaska. And in that hospital room was a 9-year-old boy who would change Bob Ross's entire life. A 9-year-old boy whose name Bob Ross has not spoken in public for 12 years. A 9-year-old boy who is the real reason the joy of painting exists at all. In March of 1979, Bob continued, a chaplain at the base hospital asked me a favor. He knew I was painting. He knew I was teaching small classes. There was a little boy on the pediatric oncology floor who had asked if anyone could come and show him how to paint. The boy was 9 years old. His father was an airman deployed overseas. His mother was a school teacher who was at the hospital every single day. The boy had been there for 4 months. He had leukemia. The doctors had stopped using the word remission. Bob paused. He pressed his hand against the wooden box. The chaplain asked me if I could come for an hour. Just to show this boy how to hold a brush. Just to give him something to do with his afternoons. I said yes. I went to the hospital on a Thursday afternoon. March 8, 1979. I remember the date because I have remembered the date every day for 12 years. I walked into the boy's room with a small canvas and a single brush and a tube of titanium white and a tube of phthalo blue. That was all. I did not want to bring too much. I did not want to overwhelm him. The boy was sitting up in bed. He was very thin. His hair was gone. He was wearing a baseball cap that was too big for his head. The studio audience was completely still. Several people had their hands pressed against their mouths. Bob's voice had not raised at all. He was telling the story the way he painted. Slowly. Carefully. With the kind of attention that made every word land. The boy looked at me, Bob said, and he said, "Are you the painter?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "My mom said you are gentle." And I sat down next to his bed. And I said, "Well, your mom is right. I am gentle. Would you like to paint with me?" And he said yes. So we painted. We painted a small sky. Just the sky. He was very tired. He could only hold the brush for about 20 minutes. But for those 20 minutes, he was not in a hospital. He was somewhere else. He was somewhere soft. A tear slid down Johnny Carson's cheek. He did not move to wipe it. I went back the next Thursday. And the Thursday after that. And the Thursday after that. For 6 weeks. I went every Thursday afternoon. I would paint with him for as long as he could stay awake. Sometimes 20 minutes. Sometimes 40. Once, near the end, only 8 minutes. And then he would sleep. And I would sit in the chair next to his bed and finish the painting we had started together. So when he woke up, the painting would be done. So he could look at it and know that even when he was tired, the painting kept going. Bob stopped. He looked at the box. The boy's name, he said quietly, was Daniel. Daniel was 9 years old. And in the last week of April 1979, Daniel asked me a question that I have not been able to stop thinking about for 12 years. Wait, do not miss this. Because what Daniel asked Bob Ross is the entire reason the joy of painting was created. It is the entire reason Bob Ross speaks the way he speaks on television. It is the entire reason every episode ends the same way. And it is the reason for the framed object that has sat on Bob Ross's easel in every single broadcast for 12 years, in plain sight of millions of viewers, that nobody has ever asked about. Johnny Carson's hand was now pressed to his lips. The cameras held on Bob Ross's face. The studio audience was making a sound that was not crying yet, but was the sound a room makes when it is becoming aware that it is about to cry. Daniel asked me, Bob said, "Can you paint the world soft?" That was the question. He said, "Can you paint the world soft, so the other scared kids will not be afraid?" And I asked him what he meant. And he said, "When you paint, you talk soft. And I am not afraid when you talk soft. So can you paint the world soft for the other kids who do not have anyone here?" And I told him, "Daniel, I am just one painter. I cannot paint the whole world." But Daniel said, "You could go on television. You could paint on television. And then all the scared kids could watch you." Bob's voice broke for the first time. He took a breath. He gathered himself. "I told him I would," Bob said. "I told a 9-year-old boy in a hospital room in Fairbanks, Alaska, that I would go on television and I would paint the world soft so that scared children would not be afraid. I made him that promise on April 26, 1979. He squeezed my hand when I said it. He was too weak to do much else." Bob looked at the box. He placed both hands on it. Daniel died on May 3, 1979. He was 9 years old. I attended his funeral. His mother gave me something at the funeral. She said Daniel had wanted me to have it. She put it in my hand and she walked away before I could say anything. I went home that night to my quarters at the base. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at what Daniel's mother had given me. And I made a decision. The studio was silent. Not a cough. Not a movement. 300 people were leaning forward in their chairs. I decided I was going to keep my promise, Bob said. I was going to retire from the Air Force as soon as my contract allowed. I was going to go on television. I was going to paint the world soft. And I was never going to mention Daniel by name, not once, because his family was very private and I would not put their grief on display. And I was going to write a letter to myself that night, sealing my promise, and I was going to keep that letter in this box. And I was not going to open the letter for as long as it took me to feel like I had truly fulfilled the promise. Because if I opened it too soon, I might think I was finished. And the promise was bigger than that. The promise was not about one show or two shows. The promise was about every scared child who was ever going to turn on the television and see me. Bob touched the lid of the wooden box. His hand was steady now. I retired from the Air Force in 1981, he continued. I started the joy of painting on PBS in January of 1983. I have recorded 403 episodes. Every single one of those episodes, before I walked on set, I touched this box. Every single one of them, I whispered 6 words to myself. The same 6 words. I said, "Today, Daniel. I am painting soft." The studio audience broke. The sound was not a single sob. It was the collective release of 300 people who had been holding their breath for too long. Women were crying openly. Men were wiping their eyes. The camera operators were trying to keep their hands steady. Johnny Carson was looking down at his desk, his face hidden behind his hand. But wait. What Bob Ross is about to reveal next is something millions of viewers of The Joy of Painting have seen with their own eyes every single episode, for 9 years. And not one of them ever noticed what it was. Bob waited for the studio to settle. He waited the way a man waits for the surface of a pond to go still again. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small folded square of paper. He unfolded it carefully. He held it up. "This," Bob said, "is what Daniel's mother gave me at the funeral. This is the thing Daniel wanted me to have." The cameras zoomed in. The audience strained to see. It was a child's crayon drawing. A simple drawing. A sun in the corner. A house with a square window. A figure with curly hair, drawn in brown crayon, holding a paintbrush. And next to the figure, words written in the careful, blocky handwriting of a 9-year-old. The words said, "The painter who talks soft." Bob held the drawing up so the camera could see it. His eyes were full now, but he was not breaking down. He was holding it together because he had been holding it together for 12 years. "I framed this drawing," he said, "in a small wooden frame. And every single episode of The Joy of Painting, this drawing has been on my easel. Not on the canvas I am painting. On the small ledge behind it. You cannot see it most of the time because the camera is focused on the painting in progress. But if you look at the wider shots, the ones at the very beginning and end of each episode, you will see a small framed something on the right side of my easel. That is this drawing. That is Daniel's drawing. It has been on every episode one have ever recorded. Millions of people have seen it. Nobody has ever asked what it was." Johnny Carson lifted his head. His eyes were red. He looked at Bob Ross with an expression that was somewhere between awe and grief and gratitude. "Bob," Johnny said. "Why now? Why tell this story tonight, after 12 years? Bob smiled. It was a small smile. A tired smile. "Because, Johnny," he said, "I went to the doctor 6 weeks ago. And the doctor told me that I am sick. And I am going to spend the next however long it takes me, fighting that. But I realized something when the doctor told me. I realized that I have kept Daniel's secret long enough. I realized that the promise I made him was that I would paint the world soft for scared kids. And I have been doing that. But the promise was incomplete. Because the scared kids who watch my show, they do not know why I am soft. They just know that I am soft. And I think Daniel would want them to know. I think Daniel would want them to know that being soft is something you choose. Being gentle is something you choose. And that even adults who seem strong, who seem certain, can choose to be gentle because somebody once asked them to be gentle for somebody else. Bob looked at the camera. He looked directly into the lens. He looked at the millions of people he could not see but knew were watching. If you are watching this tonight, Bob said, and you are scared of anything, of being sick, of being alone, of the world being too loud, I want you to know something. I am gentle on purpose. I am gentle because a 9-year-old boy in a hospital room in Alaska asked me to be. And I have been keeping a promise to him for 12 years. And I am going to keep keeping it. And so are you. Because every time you turn on this show, you are part of the promise too. The studio audience rose. Slowly, like a tide. One person, then another, then all 300 of them, standing without applauding, standing in silence, the way you stand when you do not know what else to do with your body. Johnny Carson stood up too. He walked around his desk, something he almost never did. He came to Bob Ross's chair. Bob stood up. The two men looked at each other. "May I," Johnny said, "hug you?" Bob nodded. The two of them embraced on stage. The cameras held the shot for 23 seconds. Nobody cut to commercial. Nobody said a word. 23 seconds of silence on the most watched late-night television program in America. When they finally separated, Johnny looked at Bob. He looked at the wooden box on his desk. "What is in the box, Bob?" Johnny asked. "We have heard about the drawing. But you said there was a letter. Are you going to open it?" Bob looked at the box. He smiled. "I have not opened this letter in 12 years, he said. "I think tonight is the night." He picked up the box. He unlatched the small brass clasp. He opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, faintly stained with what might have been paint, or might have been tears, from 12 years ago. Bob unfolded it. He looked at it for a long moment. He read it silently. And then he laughed. A small, soft laugh. The laugh of a man who has finally come back to himself. "Would you like to know what I wrote?" he asked Johnny. "Please," Johnny said. Bob held the letter up. He read it aloud. March 8, 1979. To Bob, from Bob. You met a boy today. His name is Daniel. He is going to ask you something soon, and you are going to say yes. And then he is going to die. And you are going to be very sad for a long time. But you are going to keep your promise. You are going to go on television. You are going to be the softest man on television. And one day, when you have done enough of it, when you have painted enough happy little trees and enough happy little clouds, when you have looked into the camera enough times and said to enough scared kids that everything is going to be all right, you are going to open this letter. And when you do, I want you to know one thing. Daniel is proud of you. And so am I. Now go paint. Bob refolded the letter. He looked at Johnny. He looked at the audience. He looked at the camera. "I think," Bob said, "I am going to go paint now." The audience erupted. Not a polite applause. Something bigger. The sound of 300 people who had been changed by what they had just witnessed and did not know how else to express it. Johnny Carson, when he finally found his voice, turned to the camera and said something he had only ever said one other time in 23 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He said, "We are going to skip the next segment tonight. I do not think I can follow that." And the show went to a long commercial break. And when the commercials ended, Johnny Carson came back on camera. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Ross." And the audience applauded for 4 minutes. And then Johnny ended the show. The switchboard at NBC was overwhelmed within 20 minutes. Phone calls from across the country. From parents whose children were sick. From people who had been watching The Joy of Painting for 9 years and had never once cried during an episode and were crying now. From veterans who had served with Bob Ross in the Air Force and had no idea about Daniel. From oncology nurses at children's hospitals who said the segment should be shown in every pediatric oncology ward in America. From a woman in Fairbanks, Alaska, who would not give her name, who simply said, "Please tell Bob, thank you for keeping the promise." The next morning, every newspaper in America carried the story. Bob Ross had revealed why he was soft. Bob Ross had told the country about Daniel. Donations to children's cancer charities increased by an amount that nobody could measure precisely, but that staff at major foundations described as unprecedented. The Joy of Painting received tens of thousands of letters in the weeks that followed. Some from children who said they were going to be gentle on purpose, because Bob said you could choose to be. Some from adults who said they had been carrying secrets too, and that Bob had given them permission to put their secrets down. Bob Ross continued to record episodes of The Joy of Painting for as long as his health allowed. He never spoke about Daniel publicly again. He did not need to. He had said what needed to be said. In the months that followed the Carson broadcast, something remarkable began to happen across America. Pediatric oncology floors at hospitals from Boston to Seattle started reporting that children in treatment were asking, specifically by name, for Bob Ross episodes to be played during their chemotherapy sessions. Nurses at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis began keeping a small library of VHS tapes of The Joy of Painting in the family lounge. A nurse there, a woman named Patricia Halloran who had worked the pediatric oncology floor for 22 years, would later say in an interview that she had seen children who refused to speak for days suddenly turn toward the television when they heard Bob Ross's voice. She said, and these are her exact words, "That voice does something nothing else does. It gets through." A children's hospital in Cleveland renamed its art therapy room after Daniel. Just Daniel. Not a last name. Not a memorial plaque with biographical details. Just his first name, painted in soft brown letters on the wall, the same shade of brown Daniel had used to draw the painter who talks soft. The hospital had reached out to Bob Ross's people. They had asked permission. Bob had said yes immediately. He had only made one request. He had asked that the room have a window. A real one. Not the painted kind. He had said, in the same voice America knew from television, that the room should let the light in because Daniel had not been able to see the sky for the last 4 months of his life, and that should not happen to any other child if it could be helped. But the most extraordinary letter Bob Ross received in the weeks after the broadcast did not come from a hospital or a parent or a viewer. It came from a man named Captain Richard Beaumont, retired, who had served with Bob Ross at Eielson Air Force Base in 1978 and 1979. Beaumont had been the base chaplain. He was the man who had asked Bob to visit Daniel in the first place. Beaumont had not seen Bob Ross in 11 years. He had been watching The Tonight Show that night with his wife. He had not known what Bob was going to say. When he saw Bob lift the wooden box, he had stood up from his recliner and walked closer to the television because he had recognized the box. He had been there the night Bob bought it. Beaumont wrote Bob a letter. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten on yellow legal paper. In it, Beaumont told Bob something Bob had never known. Beaumont said that Daniel's mother, in the days after Daniel's funeral, had come to see him at the base chapel. She had told the chaplain something she did not want Bob to know at the time, because she did not want Bob to feel any pressure. She had told the chaplain that in Daniel's last week of life, when Daniel could barely speak, when the morphine was high and the time was short, Daniel had asked his mother to promise him something. Daniel had asked his mother to promise that she would not be sad forever. He had told his mother that the painter was going to keep his promise, and that meant other scared kids were going to be okay, and that meant his mother was allowed to be okay too. He had said, in the small voice of a 9-year-old who already understood things adults spend lifetimes not understanding, that the painter had a soft voice, and softness was contagious, and one day softness would reach a lot of people who needed it, and that was a good thing to leave behind. Beaumont's letter ended with one line. It read, "Bob, she has been okay." Daniel was right. The softness reached. Bob Ross read the letter once. Then he sat at his kitchen table for an hour and did not move. Then he placed the letter inside the wooden box, next to the original letter to himself, next to the second letter he had written to Daniel on the night of the Carson appearance. The box now held 3 letters. 3 pieces of paper that, together, told a story no public broadcast had ever fully told and never quite would, because some parts of the story belonged only to Bob and Daniel's mother, and a chaplain in Alaska who had asked a tired Air Force sergeant to visit a sick boy on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1979. Bob Ross continued to record episodes of The Joy of Painting through 1993 and into 1994, recording 31 episodes of his final season while undergoing treatment. He did not tell his viewers. He did not change the way he spoke. He did not look any different on camera. He painted happy little trees. He painted clouds. He painted the gentle skies he had been painting for 12 years. And on every single one of those final episodes, Daniel's drawing sat on the right side of his easel, slightly out of focus, the way it always had, the way millions of viewers had seen without seeing for almost a decade. In May of 1995, when his health no longer allowed him to record, Bob Ross sat for one last interview, conducted quietly at his home in Florida by a small magazine, without cameras. The interview asked him if he was afraid. Bob smiled the smile America knew. He said, "I have been less afraid for 12 years than most people are their whole lives, because I have been keeping a promise. And keeping a promise is the cure for being afraid." The interview asked him what he hoped his legacy would be. Bob thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I hope somebody, somewhere, is gentle on purpose because of me. That is the only legacy that matters. The rest is happy little trees." Bob Ross passed away on July 4, 1995. He was 52 years old. Among his personal effects, his family found the small wooden box. Inside the box, the letter Bob had written to himself in 1979 was still folded. And next to the letter, there was a second piece of paper. Smaller. Handwritten in Bob's careful script. Dated September 24, 1991. The night of the Carson appearance. It read, "To Daniel. I told them. I hope you are not angry. I hope you are proud. The world is a little softer tonight. Thank you for asking me to be. I will see you on the other side. Until then, I will keep painting." The drawing of the painter who talks soft, Daniel's drawing, was found framed on Bob Ross's easel in his home studio. It had been there for 12 years. It will stay there forever. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the gentleness in your life. Think of the person who taught you that soft was not the same as weak. Think of the small promise you made to someone once that you never told anyone about, and ask yourself if it is time to keep it. Bob Ross kept his promise for 12 years before he told the world. He did not need the world to know. He just needed Daniel to know. And in the end, the world knew anyway, because gentleness, when it is real, does not have to announce itself. The world feels it. The world remembers. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Tell me about the gentle person in your life. Tell me about the promise you have been carrying. Tell me about the Daniel in your own story. Because somewhere right now, someone is watching a television screen and looking for a soft voice. And the most powerful thing any of us can do is be the soft voice for someone we will never meet. Where are you watching from? Drop your country, your city, your name in the comments. And if you have someone in your life who was gentle on purpose, who made you feel safe when the world was too loud, tell us about them. Let's remember them here together.